Beneath a heavy woolen blanket, a story was waiting to burn. In the unforgiving dust of Ashford Wells, a town where sin and sand were ground together, even a man of God couldn't wash his hands clean. And when a desperate plea echoed from the guts of an abandoned barn, it uncovered more than just a body. It uncovered a truth so rotten it threatened to swallow the whole town. Before we dive into this tale, do us a favor and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Now, let's get into it. The wind in Ashford Wells carried more secrets than it did sand. It whispered through cracked window panes and rattled the loose boards of a town that was, from its very foundation, built on a lie. A skeletal promise of a railway that never came had birthed this outpost of grit and greed. It left behind nothing but desperate men and the ghosts of forgotten dreams. Here, life was ruled by the loaded six-shooter, the cattle baron's whim, and the quiet, corrosive rot of dirty business. At the dusty edge of this lawless settlement stood a small wooden church. Its steeple was a lonely finger pointing at a vast, indifferent sky. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of old wood and the heavy weight of unconfessed sins. Caleb Rowan, the man behind the pulpit, had a voice raspy from sermons he only half believed, and a gaze that was perpetually shadowed, as if he'd seen more bloodshed than any man of the cloth ever should. The scars that mapped his body weren't from pious self-flagellation. They were a testament to a life he was desperately trying to outrun. A violent past that clung to him like the desert dust itself. He preached about guilt and penitence far more than he ever spoke of salvation, his words a grim echo of his own internal war. It was a stifling morning, the kind that promised an oppressive heat that would make the air shimmer and lie to your eyes. A few town boys, lean and quick as lizards, were chasing their namesakes near an abandoned homestead on the outskirts of town. That's when the summons reached Caleb, a young, breathless ranch hand, his face streaked with sweat and fear, burst into the cool dimness of the church. "Preacher," he gasped, "you got to come quick. Down at the old Miller place by the ridge. Something ain't right." Caleb's heart, long since caged by a forced, cold calm, gave a painful lurch. He grabbed his worn Bible, its weight a heavy, familiar anchor in his calloused hand, and followed the boy out into the punishing sun. A rising dread was already mirroring the climbing heat. The ride out was a blur of parched earth and thorny scrub. The homestead, once a place of hope, was now just a skeleton of weathered wood and broken fences being slowly swallowed by the desert. A silence deeper and more unsettling than the usual stillness of the wild hung heavy over the property. The barn, its massive doors hanging askew, seemed to exhale a stagnant, foul air. Inside, daylight filtered through wide cracks in the aged planks, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting fractured beams across the straw-littered floor. The air was thick with the smell of old hay, of decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp that clung to the back of the throat. Caleb's eyes, adjusting to the gloom, swept the cavernous space. They landed on a huddled form on the dirt floor, half hidden by a collapsed stack of baling wire. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he drew closer, the scene sharpened into a horrifying picture. A young woman lay prone, almost entirely hidden by a heavy, dark woolen blanket. It was far too thick for the sweltering heat. Only her pale wrists were visible, raw and chafed, bearing the unmistakable deep grooves of rope. A wave of ice washed over Caleb. An ancient, protective instinct he thought he'd buried stirred deep within him. He knelt, his knees protesting on the hard-packed dirt. The blanket felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by more than just wool. As his hand brushed the coarse fabric, trying to see her face, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper escaped her lips. "Don't uncover me. Please." The words were broken and fragile, but they carried a depth of shame and terror that pierced right through Caleb's carefully constructed defenses. But the urgency of the moment, the stark evidence of what she'd suffered, spurred him on. With a gentle but resolute grip, he pulled back the heavy blanket, and the sight that met his eyes would be seared into his memory forever. It wasn't just the angry bruises blossoming across her skin, or the hollow desperation in her wide, terrified eyes. It was the marks, crude, deliberate designs burned deep into her flesh. They weren't just a brand, not the simple mark of a cattle ranch. These were symbols, an intricate, barbaric sigil of ownership etched onto her pale skin. Her eyes, filled with a primal terror, darted wildly, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had seen countless wounds in his lifetime, scars from bullets and blades, but these were different. They spoke of a dehumanization so profound it twisted his gut. Without a word, he carefully lifted her. Her body was shockingly light, as fragile as a bird's. He carried her out of the suffocating barn and into the glaring sunlight, his steps measured and deliberate, heading towards the only sanctuary he could offer, his small, lonely church. Back inside its cedar-scented walls, he laid her gently on a pew. He cleaned her wounds, the sting of the antiseptic making her shudder, but she never made a sound. He gave her water, which she drank in small, hesitant sips, her gaze fixed on some unseen point far beyond the rough wooden walls. For hours, the woman who would later be known as June Holstead remained silent. She cowered on the hard bench, her small frame hunched as if the very roof of the church might collapse on her. Her haunted, distant eyes watched every shadow, every flicker of lamplight, betraying a terror too deep for words. Caleb watched her, a silent sentinel, a preacher grappling with a darkness far older and more insidious than any devil he'd ever preached against. The danger that stalked her, though unseen, felt palpable within the quiet church. It was a cold whisper against the beating heart of a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Days bled into nights inside that quiet church. Each sunrise painted the desert in hues of amber and rust, and each sunset deepened the shadows that clung to June. Caleb Rowan moved with a deliberate gentleness, his presence a silent anchor in her storm-tossed world. He brought her meager meals, dry bread, a piece of jerky, water from the well, and tended to the fading marks on her wrists. His touches were light, respectful, as if handling something sacred and broken. He spoke little, sensing that words were useless against the magnitude of her trauma. He offered instead a kind of paternal watchfulness, both protective and profoundly lonely. June remained a creature of stillness, a fragile bird caught in an unfamiliar cage. Her eyes were always wide, always alert. She flinched at sudden sounds and retracted at any unexpected movement. She would sit for hours on the hard pew, knees drawn to her chest, a silent monument to the fear that still owned her. But the human spirit, even when shattered, yearns for connection. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fortress she had built around herself began to show hairline cracks. It started with her eyes following Caleb as he moved about the church, performing mundane tasks, trimming lamp wicks, sweeping the worn floor, polishing the small tarnished crucifix that hung above the altar. Then came the questions. They were whispered and hesitant, barely audible over the perpetual sigh of the desert wind. "Does it always blow like this?" she asked one afternoon, her voice raspy from disuse, her gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. "Mostly," Caleb replied, his own voice equally soft. "The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily." Another day, as he mended a tear in his sermon notes, she asked, "Is the town always so quiet?" "Only when it's sleeping," he responded, his dark, knowing eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. "Ashford Wells has its own kind of noise." These trivial exchanges were a lifeline, a tentative reach back towards a world from which she had been brutally severed. As days turned into weeks, the silences between them grew heavier, not with fear, but with an unspoken understanding. She would watch him, and he her, in long moments laden with the unarticulated stories of their own scars. Her trauma was a palpable presence, but so too was Caleb's quiet burden, the weight of a violent past that shadowed his every prayer. Then the sky cracked open. A tempest that had been brewing for days in the oppressive heat finally unleashed its fury upon Ashford Wells. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the old church, making the wooden structure groan and shiver. Rain, thick and relentless, hammered against the roof, an angry drumbeat drowning out all other sounds. Inside, the small lamps flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like tormented spirits on the walls. The air grew heavy, charged with the electric energy of the storm, mirroring the unseen tension that had been building between Caleb and June. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore at one of the tall, narrow windows near the altar. The old wooden frame groaned, then shrieked, threatening to burst inward. Caleb, his face grim, rushed to brace it, his powerful shoulders straining against the force of the gale. As he wrestled with the rebellious pain, the glass rattling furiously, he felt a small, determined presence beside him. June, her face pale but resolute, was pushing against the frame too. Her small hands were pressed against the vibrating wood, trying to lend her meager strength to hold back the storm. Their hands, his calloused from toil and a gun's grip, hers from harsh labor and rope burns, met on the cold, damp wood. It was an accidental brush, then a deliberate tightening as the window bucked violently. In that shared moment of struggle against the raw power of nature, something shifted. The fierce wind seemed to strip away the layers they had carefully constructed around themselves. The fear in June's eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a spark of defiance, of shared purpose. Caleb, his breath ragged from exertion, found his gaze locked with hers. The world outside raged, but inside, a different kind of storm was breaking. The weight of his own repressed desires, a sin he had preached against for years, surged through him, raw and undeniable. For June, it was a sudden, overwhelming need to feel alive, to feel something other than terror and shame. Their faces drew closer, the urgency of the moment obliterating all thought, all reason. His lips met hers, not in a gentle caress, but an urgent, almost violent collision. It was a kiss born of desperation, of two damaged souls reaching for solace in the face of oblivion. His hand, no longer on the window, cupped her face, his thumb tracing the scarred line of her cheekbone. Her fingers, trembling, clutched at his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. The storm raged, the church groaned, and the flickering lamplight cast their embracing forms in stark relief against the ancient wooden walls. What followed was inevitable, a primal response to prolonged despair. There, between the silent, empty pews, on the worn wooden floor where sermons of purity and damnation had been spoken, their bodies found each other. It was not an act of grace, but of raw, desperate need. Caleb surrendered to the man he had tried to bury, and June gave herself over as if to prove to herself and to the raging world that she was still capable of feeling, of living. The heavy woolen blanket from the barn was a distant, terrible memory, replaced by the warmth of Caleb's arms, the beating of his heart against her own. Afterward, as the rain finally softened and the wind began to subside, a fragile quiet settled over the church. June, nestled against Caleb, her head on his shoulder, began to speak. Her voice was a bare whisper, almost swallowed by the fading echoes of the storm. "I was bought," she murmured, the words tearing at her throat. "Like cattle, by a man here in Ashford Wells, a powerful man." The revelation hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the intimacy they had just shared. He said he needed a servant for his house, but that wasn't all he wanted. The full horror of her captivity began to unfold. She spoke of a man named Harland Pike, the cattle baron whose land and influence choked the life out of the town. Her family's fortunes had collapsed, and she'd been sold to him, a piece of property. Her days were relentless chores on his ranch. Her nights were a brutal reality that stripped her of her dignity, leaving the indelible marks on her skin as his proof of ownership. Then defiance had ignited. While cleaning Pike's study, she'd found a loose floorboard. Beneath it, a hidden compartment revealed damning documents, ledgers detailing contraband shipments, names of bribed officials, illicit business accounts. It was Pike's entire criminal empire laid bare on paper. A desperate hope sparked within her. She stole the papers, hiding them for a chance at freedom, a chance to expose him. But Pike was meticulous. He noticed the missing documents. He sensed her defiance. The realization that she knew too much transformed him from a cruel master into a monster. He demanded the papers. She refused, clinging to the secret as her last shred of power. That refusal sealed her fate. He dragged her to that remote barn, bound her, and for days subjected her to brutal torture, all to force a confession. She resisted, holding on to her secret until Caleb found her. As her broken confession ended, the true face of evil in Ashford Wells settled upon Caleb. He saw the branded marks not just as physical wounds, but as symbols of the systemic corruption poisoning the entire town. His paternal care morphed into something volatile, something dangerous. His hands, which had once been so lethal, clenched into fists. The faith he had built as a shield against his violent past now felt like a flimsy, useless thing. Protecting June meant more than just hiding her. It meant confronting Pike head-on. It meant resurrecting the man he'd tried so hard to bury. Meanwhile, at his sprawling ranch, Harlan Pike savored a glass of whiskey, his gaze cold and calculating. His informants were efficient. Casual saloon chatter about the preacher and his mysterious, bedraggled guest had reached his ears. A cold dread, which quickly turned to white-hot fury, tightened his gut. It had to be her. June. And if she was alive, she still had the papers. He summoned Wade Cutter and Jonas Keene, his most loyal enforcers. Cutter, a brutal behemoth of a man, stomped in. Keene followed, leaner, his eyes holding a calculating, dangerous gleam. "The preacher has her," Pike rasped, venom dripping from his voice. "Get her back, and make an example of him." Cutter grinned cruelly. Keene simply nodded, a silent, deadly promise. The pre-dawn hours held a deceptive stillness. A cold mist clung to Ashford Wells, rendering the town square a spectral, empty stage. The wooden church stood alone, a precarious sanctuary. Inside, Caleb couldn't sleep. The weight of June's confession and the weight of his own past pressed down on him. June herself, exhausted, had finally fallen into a fitful sleep on a pile of blankets near the altar. A horse whinnied, the sound cutting sharply through the quiet, followed by the soft thud of approaching hooves. Caleb's long-suppressed instincts flared to life. He moved silently to the pulpit and retrieved the old Colt. 45 he kept hidden beneath it. The heavy steel felt like a chilling comfort in his palm, a relic from another life. He peered through a crack in the front door. Two figures emerged from the mist, ominous silhouettes against the gray dawn. Cutter, a hulking shadow, and Keene, moving with a predator's fluid grace. They were carrying rifles. They were ready for a war. "June," Caleb whispered urgently, shaking her awake. "They're here." Cold, paralyzing fear gripped June as she saw the grim resolve in Caleb's face, the pistol in his hand. Before she could react, the church doors burst inward with a splintering crash. Cutter and Keene filled the entryway, their eyes burning with malevolent intent. "Preacher!" Cutter bellowed, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "Pike wants his property back." Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't preach. He didn't pray. The colt barked, a deafening roar that shattered the morning's peace. Cutter staggered backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He gasped, a look of shocked surprise on his face, then crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering on the wooden floor. He was down, but Keen was faster, smarter. As the smoke cleared from Caleb's pistol, Keen unleashed a rapid volley of shots from his own rifle. Bullets tore into the altar's wooden framework, sending splinters flying. Caleb dove behind a heavy pew for cover, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. A moment of tense silence. Then, with terrifying speed, Keen flanked him, holstering his rifle and drawing a long, wicked-looking Bowie knife. Caleb tried to raise his pistol, but Keen was already on him, a whirlwind of calculated violence. A searing pain exploded in Caleb's side as the blade sliced deep. A grunt escaped him as he stumbled. Keen, relentless, delivered a brutal kick, sending the preacher sprawling onto the cold church floor. The colt skittered out of reach. Caleb lay there, gasping, pressing a hand to his bleeding side, his vision blurring at the edges. Keen stood over him, the bloody knife raised, his face devoid of all emotion. He moved to deliver the final, killing blow. Hidden behind an overturned pew, June had witnessed the entire brutal scene. Caleb, her protector, her savior, was helpless at the mercy of Pike's enforcer. The terror that had consumed her for weeks was violently, suddenly replaced by a desperate, protective fury. Her eyes darted from Keen's poised knife to Caleb's discarded pistol, lying just a few feet away. A stark, terrifying decision had to be made, and it had to be made right now. Their survival hinged entirely on her. June's world narrowed to a single point of action. Jonas Keen's knife was raised, looming over a bleeding and helpless Caleb. A raw, protective fury eclipsed her terror completely. Her eyes, burning with a desperate resolve, darted to Caleb's Colt, 45, lying abandoned on the dusty floorboards. With a gasp that was half prayer and half curse, she launched herself from behind the pew, snatching the heavy pistol. It felt alien in her hand, terrifying, yet in that single moment it also felt like an extension of her own will. Keen, startled by the sudden movement, spun around, but it was too late. June aimed not with practiced skill, but with pure instinct, her hands trembling but her purpose firm. The deafening shot ripped through the church, a sound of judgment and finality. Keen reeled back, a look of disbelief on his face. He clutched at his chest, then collapsed, the Bowie knife clattering loudly in the sudden, absolute silence. The silence was broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing and the frantic, hammering beat of June's own heart. She stood there, the pistol still extended, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. Her body trembled, but a fundamental shift had occurred. The victim, the piece of property, the branded cattle, that person was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in fire, a woman who had just taken a life to save another, a woman who had chosen her own fate. Caleb, his vision clearing, watched her with a mixture of horror and fierce, undeniable pride. He managed a weak, blood-flecked smile. June, he breathed. The next few days were a blur of pain and resilience. Caleb, gravely wounded, lay on a cot in the back room of the church. June meticulously tended to his knife wound, cleaning it, bandaging it, feeding him broth. Her touch was no longer hesitant. It was imbued with a quiet, steely confidence. The bodies of Cutter and Keen were discovered, and the sheriff, publicly loyal to Pike, was forced to make a show of an investigation, weighed down by the rumors and scrutiny of the townsfolk. Whispers spread like wildfire through Ashford Wells, of the preacher's mysterious guest, of gunfire at the church, of a woman who fought back. While Caleb slowly mended, June knew their reprieve was temporary. Pike's wrath would be absolute. The documents were their only weapon, their only hope. With a fierce determination that burned away her remaining fear, she resolved to retrieve them. Under the cloak of night, a few days after the shootout, June slipped out of the church. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her step was firm. She moved like a ghost through the grounds of Pike's Ranch, every shadow, every building intimately familiar to her. The place of her imprisonment was now a map to her liberation. She went straight to the stables. Behind a heavy feed trough, a single loose brick concealed a hollow space. Her fingers brushed against rough canvas. The tightly wrapped bundle of documents sent a jolt of triumph through her. She clutched it to her chest, a silent vow to herself and to Caleb. The following morning, a restless Ashford Wells gathered in the town square. Rumors had drawn a crowd before the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody stood on the steps, his face uneasy, beads of sweat on his brow. Then a path cleared in the crowd. June emerged. She walked with a newfound composure, her gaze steady and unwavering. By her side, leaning heavily on a cane, his arm in a sling, was Caleb. His face was pale, but his eyes held a burning, unwavering support for her. June stopped directly in front of the sheriff. She held the bundle of documents firmly in her hand. A hush fell over the entire square. Her voice, though soft, was resonant and carried in the still air. "Sheriff Brody," she began, "I believe you'll find these illuminating." She handed him the papers. Brody, visibly paling, unfolded them. As he read, his hands began to shake. Urged on by the expectant stares of the crowd, he began to read aloud. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled people as he recited the meticulous lists of contraband, the names of complicit businesses, the bribes paid to officials, including his own name. Harlan Pike's insidious corruption, his stranglehold on Ashford Wells, was laid bare for all to see. Murmurs swelled into angry shouts. Faces hardened with the outrage of betrayal. Pike, arriving moments before to witness what he assumed would be the capture of his property, watched with dawning horror as his empire crumbled around him in a matter of seconds. The crowd turned on him, their jeers and curses a deafening chorus. Exposed, stripped of his power, Pike was arrested by a trembling Sheriff Brody, the clicking of the handcuffs lost amidst the thunderous boos of the people he had oppressed for so long. In the aftermath, Ashford Wells slowly began to heal. Caleb Rowan, no longer standing behind the pulpit, but standing beside June, knew his path as a preacher was over. His old life of penance had yielded to a new one, defined not by forgotten sins, but by the woman whose strength had forced him to confront his true self. June, no longer anyone's property, shed her past like a snake sheds its skin. The branded marks on her flesh were no longer symbols of shame, but a testament to her unyielding spirit. They stood together, their future uncertain, but intertwined forever. Their story became a legend in Ashford Wells, the preacher who found his purpose beyond the pages of a book, and the marked woman who defied a tyrant. And the heavy woolen blanket which had once hidden a victim came to symbolize the moment a town was forced to look at the truth it had tried so hard to ignore. What would you have done in Caleb's place, standing between your faith and a fight for justice? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story held you until the very end, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold tales of the Old West. Turn on those notifications so you never miss what comes next. Because out here, every whisper carries the weight of a buried truth.